We're here in an African American museum to talk about African American history, so much of which is truly unknown today. For example, few know of James Armistead, a black patriot and spy during the American Revolution who helped make possible the 1781 Yorktown victory that established America as an independent nation. Or Peter Salem, a black patriot who was a hero of the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill. He also fought as one of the legendary Minutemen and was a soldier at the battles of Saratoga and Stony Point. And in the famous picture, the 1776 crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night, two men depicted at the front of the boat include Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell, two black patriots who served with George Washington and the American generals during the Revolution. Few are aware that many of the soldiers who fought during the American Revolution were black. And unlike the later segregated regiments in the Civil War, many of the units in the American Revolution were fully integrated, with black patriots fighting and dying side by side with their white fellow comrades and soldiers. And equally unknown is much of what occurred in black political history. That history will surprise and perhaps even shock you. But as you will see, it's a history based on indisputable facts and documents. Too often today, only a handful of the heroes from black history are presented, much like showing only a snapshot or two out of several albums of photos. Too much is not seen, and often too much is wrongly assumed just from the little that is seen. One of the world's oldest history books, the Bible, offers a good lesson on this point. We all know the Bible story of David's victory over Goliath, yet the Bible also tells the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and of his failure with his son Absalom. If all we learned about David were his failures, that would not be the complete story. On the other hand, if all we learned about David were his victories, neither would that be the complete story. It takes all of these accounts to present the full, accurate story. So from the Bible, and from former writers in black history, such as William Nell, Carter Woodson, Benjamin Quarles, Joseph Wilson, Booker T. Washington, Edward Johnson, and others, we learn that you must present the good, the bad, and the ugly to get the full story not only of history in general, but of African American political history in particular. Although the history of black Americans begins in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves in America, the political history of black Americans actually begins in the year 1787, the year in which the American political system was constructed. 1787 was the year the Constitution was written. Today, many critics assert that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and to prove this, they point to the 3/5 clause, claiming that the Constitution says that blacks are only 3/5 of a person. One of the earliest black Americans to investigate this claim was the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been born into slavery and remained a slave until he escaped to New York. 3 years after his escape, he delivered an anti-slavery speech in Massachusetts. He was promptly hired to work for the state's anti-slavery society, and he also served as a preacher at Zion Methodist Church. During Douglass's first years in freedom in the North, he studied at the feet of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who taught him that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglass accepted this claim, and his early speeches and writings reflected that belief. However, Douglass later began to research the issue for himself. He read the Constitution. He read the writings of those who wrote the Constitution, and what he found revolutionized his thinking. He concluded that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, but rather it was an anti-slavery document. He explained,
I was on the anti-slavery question fully committed to the doctrine touching the pro-slavery character of the Constitution. I advocated this with pen and tongue according to the best of my ability. However, upon a latter reconsideration of the whole subject, I became convinced that the Constitution of the United States not only contained no guarantees in favor of slavery, but on the contrary, it is in its letter and spirit an anti-slavery instrument demanding the abolition of slavery as a condition of its own existence as the supreme law of the land. Now, here was a radical change in my opinions.
But if the Constitution is not pro-slavery, then what about the 3/5 clause? Had Douglass not read that clause? Yes, he had. Then how could he conclude what he did about the Constitution? It was very simple. He understood that the 3/5 clause dealt only with representation and not the worth of any person. You see, the Constitution had established that for every 30,000 inhabitants in a state, that state would receive one representative to Congress. The Southern states saw this as an opportunity to strengthen slavery. Slaves accounted for much of the Southern population. In fact, almost half the inhabitants of South Carolina were slaves. Therefore, slave owners could simply count their slaves as regular inhabitants, and by so doing could almost double the number of their pro-slavery representatives to Congress. Of course, the anti-slavery leaders from the North strenuously objected to this. After all, slave owners did not consider their slaves to be persons, but only property. These slave owners were therefore using their property, that is, their slaves, to increase the power of the slave states in Congress. The anti-slavery leaders fully wanted free blacks counted, but not slaves, if counting slaves would increase the power of slave owners. They understood that the fewer the pro-slavery representatives to Congress, the sooner slavery could be eradicated from the nation. Several founders, including James Wilson and Elbridge Gerry, even used the slaveholders' own arguments against them. These anti-slavery founders argued that if the South was going to count its property, that is, its slaves, in order to get more pro-slavery representation in Congress, then the North would count its property, that is, its houses, cows, and horses, to get more anti-slavery representation in Congress. Of course, the South objected just as strongly to this proposal as the North had objected to counting slaves. The final compromise was that only 60% of slaves, that is, 3/5 of slaves, would be counted to calculate the number of Southern representatives to Congress. In other words, it would take 50,000 slaves rather than just 30,000 before slaveholding states could get a representative in Congress, thus greatly reducing the number of representatives to Congress from states with extraordinarily large slave populations. This, then, is the 3/5 clause. It had nothing to do with the worth of any individual. In fact, free blacks in the North and the South often were extended the full rights of a citizen and regularly voted, both in the North and the South. The 3/5 clause had to do only with representation. It was an anti-slavery provision designed to limit the number of pro-slavery representatives in Congress. This is why Frederick Douglass, unlike many today who have never taken time to study the Constitution, could emphatically declare that the Constitution, all of the Constitution, was anti-slavery. In 1789, following the ratification of the Constitution, Congress expanded its fight to end slavery by passing the Northwest Ordinance. That law forbade slavery in any of the federal territories then held, and for this reason, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin all eventually came into the nation as free states. On the federal level, progress was being made toward ending slavery and achieving full civil rights for black Americans. Another important point in black political history occurred 3 years later. In 1792, according to the website of the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Party was started by Thomas Jefferson. The Democratic Party definitely played a role in black political history, a role that will be examined shortly. Some years later, in 1808, Congress continued its fight against slavery by abolishing the slave trade. A famous sermon commemorating the abolition of the slave trade was given by the Reverend Absalom Jones, the first black bishop of the Episcopal Church in America. His sermon was delivered in the famous St. Thomas's Church. Very few today know that in 1808 Congress abolished the slave trade, or that Bishop Absalom Jones delivered such a compelling sermon. Although slavery still had not been abolished in all the states, things definitely were moving in the right direction. Yet a major reversal was about to occur. By 1820, most of the Founding Fathers were dead, and Thomas Jefferson's party, the Democratic Party, had become the majority party in Congress. With this new party in charge, a change in congressional policy emerged. Recall that the 1789 law prohibited slavery in a federal territory. In 1820, the Democratic Congress passed the Missouri Compromise and reversed that earlier policy, permitting slavery in almost half of the federal territories. Several states were subsequently admitted as slave states, and for the first time since the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, slavery was being officially promoted by congressional policy. Several other pro-slavery laws were also passed by Democrats in Congress, including the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. That law required Northerners to return escaped slaves back into slavery or else pay huge fines. In many instances, the law became little more than an excuse for Southern slave hunters to kidnap free blacks in the North and carry them into slavery in the South. For if a black was simply accused of being a slave, regardless of whether he actually was or not, under the Fugitive Slave Law, he was denied the benefit both of a jury trial and the right of habeas corpus, despite the fact that those rights had been explicitly guaranteed by the Constitution. Because the Fugitive Slave Law allowed free blacks to be carried into slavery, this law was disastrous for blacks in the North. And as a consequence of the atrocious provisions of this Democratic law, some 20,000 blacks in the North completely left the United States and fled to Canada. In fact, the Underground Railroad reached the height of its activity during this period, helping thousands of slaves escape from slavery in the South all the way into Canada, simply to escape the reach of the Democrats' Fugitive Slave Law. In 1854, the Democratic-controlled Congress passed another law strengthening slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, thus allowing slavery to be introduced into parts of the new territory where it previously had been forbidden, thereby increasing the national area in which slavery would be permitted. By the way, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Territory included not only Kansas and Nebraska, but also what is now part of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Therefore, by extending slavery into parts of the Kansas-Nebraska Territory, Democrats were pushing slavery westward across the nation, essentially from coast to coast. Following the passage of these pro-slavery laws in Congress, in May of 1854, a number of the anti-slavery Democrats in Congress formed a new political party to fight slavery and secure equal rights for black Americans. The name of that party? They called it the Republican Party. They called it that because they wanted to return to the principles of freedom and equality first set forth in the governing documents of the Republic before the pro-slavery members of Congress had perverted those original principles. One of the founders of that new party was U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, who had taken the seat of the great anti-slavery Senator Daniel Webster. Sumner had a record of promoting civil rights. In fact, he had championed the desegregation of public schools in Boston. Here is his argument before the state Supreme Court on that issue. In 1856, Sumner gave a 2-day-long speech in the U.S. Senate against slavery. Following that speech, Democratic Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina came from the House, across the rotunda of the Capitol, and over to the Senate, where he literally clubbed down Sumner on the floor of the Senate, knocked him unconscious, and beat him almost to death. According to the sources of that day, many Democrats thought that Sumner's clubbing was deserved, and it even amused them. It was 3.5 years before Sumner recovered himself sufficiently to return to the Senate. And not surprisingly, the first speech he delivered on his return to the Senate was again against slavery. In 1856, the Republican Party entered its first presidential election. In that election, the Republican Party issued this, its first party platform. It was a short document. There were only 9 planks in the platform, but significantly, 6 of the 9 planks set forth bold declarations of equality and civil rights for African Americans based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Democratic platform of that year took an opposite position, strongly defending slavery. In fact, it warned,
"All efforts of the abolitionists are calculated to lead to the most alarming and dangerous consequences, and all such efforts have an inevitable tendency to diminish the happiness of the people."
Amazingly, according to Democrats in 1856, attempting to end slavery would ruin the happiness of the people. Despite such clear differences, the Republicans lost that election. The next year, 1857, a Democrat-controlled Supreme Court delivered this, the Dred Scott decision, declaring blacks were not persons or citizens, but instead were property and therefore had no rights. In fact, quoting from this infamous decision, Democrats on the court announced that blacks
had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
In the 1860 presidential election, Republican Abraham Lincoln ran against Democrat U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Both parties again issued platforms. The Republican platform of 1860 blasted both the fugitive slave law and the Dred Scott decision, and it announced its continued intent to end slavery and secure equal civil rights for black Americans. On the other hand, the Democrats in their 1860 platform praised both the fugitive slave law and the Dred Scott decision. In fact, Democrats handed out copies of the Dred Scott decision along with their platform to affirm their belief that it was proper to have slavery and to hold African Americans in bondage. It is worth noting that for over a century and a half, Democrats often have taken a position that some human life is disposable, as they did in the Dred Scott decision. In that instance, a black individual was not a life, it was property, and you could do with your property as you wished. Today, Democrats have largely taken that same position on unborn human life, that an unborn human is really just disposable property to do with as one wishes. African Americans were the victims of this disposable property ideology a century and a half ago and still are today. Consider, although only 12% of the current population is African American, almost 35% of all abortions are performed on African Americans. In fact, over the last decade, for every 100 African American live births, there were 53 abortions of African American babies. Democrats have encouraged this. In fact, congressional Democrats are almost rabidly pro-abortion, and they consistently vote against protections for innocent unborn human life. For over a century and a half, Democrats have wrongly argued that some human life is merely disposable personal property, and black Americans have suffered most under this philosophy. In the 1860 presidential election, Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected with only 40% of the popular vote, but 59% of the Electoral College vote. Republicans also won a majority in the U.S. House and Senate in that election, thus giving Republicans control of the lawmaking process for the very first time. Given the bold anti-slavery and pro-civil rights positions set forth by Republicans in their platforms, it was obvious to Democrats what was about to occur. The anti-slavery and pro-civil rights position of the Republicans were about to become reality. What was the Democratic response? Southern Democrats left Congress and took their states with them, forming a nation that described itself as the slave-holding Confederate States of America. While Northern Democrats did not support secession, they nonetheless generally supported slavery and opposed civil rights for black Americans. In short, the main difference between Southern and Northern Democrats at that time was their view on secession, not slavery. Who were the leaders of that new nation of slave-holding states? Democratic U.S. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi became the president of this new slave-holding nation, and Democratic Representative Alexander Stephens of Georgia became its vice president. However, returning to the election of 1860, with Republicans firmly in control of the federal government, they quickly began implementing significant changes. In 1862, Republicans abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, freeing all slaves in the southern states in rebellion. In 1864, following the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, several civil rights laws and laws preparing to facilitate civil rights were passed. One of them was this bill establishing the Freedmen's Bureau. Another was this bill equalizing pay for soldiers in the military, whether white or black. The Fugitive Slave Law was also repealed that year over the almost unanimous opposition of the Northern Democrats still in Congress. While Republicans in the North were working to end slavery and secure civil rights, the new nation of Southern Democrats was determined to head in an opposite direction. In fact, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, the Democrat from Georgia, delivered a speech entitled African Slavery, the Cornerstone of the Southern Confederacy. In that speech, Stephens first correctly acknowledged that the Founding Fathers, even those from the South, had never intended for slavery to remain in America.
The prevailing ideas entertained by Thomas Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the foundation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature. But the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be temporary and pass away.
So what did Vice President Stevens and the new Confederate nation think about these anti-slavery ideas of the Founding Fathers?
The founders' ideas against slavery were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error, and the idea of a government built upon it. Our new government, the Confederate States of America, is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior white race, is the natural and moral condition of the Negro. This, our new Confederate government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth.
There was indeed a clear difference between the philosophy of the Republicans and of Democrats on the issue of race and racial equality. Southern Democrats had been willing to form an entire nation on the foundation of white supremacy, and there was no doubt that the South was strongly Democratic. As a leading South Carolina Democrat testified during an 1871 congressional hearing.
For the purposes of this hearing, sir, could you provide a breakdown along party lines as exists in your state?
Almost 999 of 1,000 of the decent people of South Carolina belong to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is composed entirely of the colored people.
When it came time for the presidential election of 1864, Southern Democrats were still fighting against the Union. Therefore, the presidential candidate for the Democrats that year was a Northern Democrat, Union General George B. McClellan. McClellan was actually running for president against his own commander-in-chief, but there was a clear difference between the two. In fact, Abraham Lincoln had twice replaced McClellan for failing to obey Lincoln's orders to launch aggressive attacks against the Confederacy. General McClellan's pro-Southern sympathetic behavior was in direct contrast with that of other Northern military leaders. And not surprisingly, the anti-black tone of this Northern Democrat shone through in his presidential campaign. For example, examine this 1864 campaign piece for General McClellan. According to McClellan, since white lives were being lost, and since Republicans were seeking both abolition and Negro equality, McClellan argues that he, as a Democrat, should be elected so that he could halt those policies. Republicans also took clear positions in that 1864 presidential campaign. The 1864 Republican platform therefore called for a constitutional amendment to completely abolish slavery, and work was begun in Congress almost immediately on that amendment. That same year, President Lincoln won re-election to a second term. It was in 1865 that the Civil War finally came to a close. The nation of slaveholding states had been defeated. President Lincoln and the black troops of the 29th Connecticut Regiment visited Richmond, the former capital of the Confederate States of America. An officer in that black regiment recorded the scene.
As the president passed along the street, the colored people waved their handkerchiefs, hats, and bonnets and expressed their gratitude by shouting repeatedly, "Thank God for his goodness. We have seen his salvation." The white soldier caught the sound and swelled the numbers, cheering as they marched along. All could see the president. He was so tall. One woman shouted, "Thank you, dear Jesus, for this sight of the great conqueror." No wonder tears came to the president's eyes when he looked on the poor colored people who were once slaves and heard the blessing uttered from thankful hearts and thanksgiving to God and Jesus. Thousands of colored men in Richmond would have laid down their lives for President Lincoln.
By the way, in these accounts and hundreds of others, the strong Christian faith of black Americans is apparent. That faith is as active today as it ever was, for a number of recent polls show that Christian beliefs are higher among African Americans than among any other group in the country. Returning to 1865, there were numerous celebrations by black Americans and others at the end of the Civil War, but even before the war had come to an end, a vote had been held in Congress on the constitutional amendment to abolish slavery, the 13th Amendment. Congress passed that amendment, and this poster was quickly issued to honor the 137 members of Congress who had voted to abolish slavery. At the time of that vote, there were 118 Republicans in Congress and 82 Northern Democrats. Of the 118 Republicans, all 118 voted to abolish slavery. However, of the 82 Democrats, only 19 voted to end slavery. Only 23% of Democrats, and these were the Northern Democrats. When the vote had been taken in Congress on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, the chambers had been packed from wall to wall with expectant observers. When the numbers were counted, and it was announced that the amendment had passed, a roar erupted from the thousands in the chamber. Hats were thrown and voices were raised in exuberant cheers. Congress had voted to end slavery. How should something that profound be celebrated? Members of the House asked that a sermon be preached to commemorate the event. And whom did they ask to preach the sermon? The Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. Garnett became the first African American to speak in the halls of Congress, and he preached this sermon on Sunday, February the 12th, 1865, and it was powerful. He began that sermon with a recollection of his own personal experiences.
What is slavery? Too well do I know what it is. I was born among the cherished institutions of slavery. My earliest recollection of parents, friends, and the home of my childhood are clouded with its wrongs. The first sight that met my eyes was my Christian mother enslaved.
Garnett then reviewed the prominent historical leaders of both church and state who had strongly opposed slavery.
The other day, when the light of liberty streamed through this marble building and the hearts of a noble band of patriotic statesmen leaped for joy, and this, our national capital, shook from foundation to dome with the shouts of a ransomed people. Then methinks the spirits of Washington, Jefferson, the Jays, the Adams, and Franklin, and Lafayette, Giddings, and Lovejoy, and those of all the mighty and glorious dead remembered by history because they were faithful to truth, justice, and liberty, were hovering over this august assembly. Though unseen by mortal eyes, doubtless they joined the angelic choir and said, Amen! Hallelujah!
Reverend Garnett then concluded by calling on the states to ratify the amendment passed by Congress.
Let the verdict of death which has been brought in against slavery by this Congress be affirmed and executed by the people. Let the gigantic monster perish. Yes, perish now and perish forever. Let slavery die. Its death warrant is signed by God and man. And honorable senators and representatives, illustrious rulers of this great nation, your act so sublime could not escape divine notice. The deed has been recorded in the archives of heaven. Amen.
This was a momentous event. The first black American to speak in the Capitol, and he delivered a powerful sermon. Interestingly, in the front of this sermon is a revealing message. It is a message of thanks passed by the leadership of Reverend Garnett's 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. The church trustees were so pleased with the honor bestowed on their pastor that they passed a resolution declaring that it was the Republican members of the House who had asked Reverend Garnett to speak. The Democrats in the House did not join in inviting him to preach a sermon. Yet this is not surprising given the demonstrated attitude of Democrats toward blacks at that time, and it's not surprising judging by the Democratic opposition to traditional public religious expressions and activities that they still demonstrate even in the most recent years. For example, Even though nearly 80% of the nation supports voluntary spoken prayer in public schools, only 13% of Democrats voted for a recent constitutional amendment to permit it. And even though almost 80% of the nation supports public displays of the Ten Commandments, only 21% of Democrats voted for a congressional bill to allow those displays. Consider, too, the congressional bill to remove IRS control from over what pastors can say, a bill that would reinstate freedom of speech to American pulpits exactly the way it had been before Lyndon Baines Johnson amended the IRS code in 1954 to restrict speech in churches. Only 5% of Democrats voted to allow free speech for churches. There are many other votes in Congress demonstrating a general Democratic hostility toward laws protecting public religious expressions, just as a century and a half ago when they would not join in inviting the Reverend Garnett to deliver his sermon. Because of the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery, black Americans, particularly in the South, could now enjoy their first real taste of civil rights, their first genuine opportunity for political participation. Within a year, blacks were registering to vote and were forming political parties across the South. For example, at a rally in Houston, Texas, on July the 4th, 1867, 150 blacks and 20 whites formed the Republican Party of Texas, and black Americans also started other Southern Republican parties as well. In fact, the first 42 blacks elected to the state legislature in Texas were all Republicans. And in Louisiana, the first 95 black representatives and the first 32 black senators were, again, all Republicans. Similarly, in Alabama, the first 103 blacks elected to the state legislature were all Republicans. In Mississippi, the first 112 black legislators were Republicans.
In South Carolina, the first 190. In Virginia, the first 46. In Florida, the first 30, and the same in North Carolina. And in Georgia, 41 blacks were elected to the state legislature, all as Republicans.
So great were the gains of blacks through the Republican Party that Democrats began to fight back in other ways. Recall that black Americans had made huge gains in Louisiana with the election of 127 black legislators and even a black lieutenant governor, P.B.S. Pinchback, who later became state governor. To halt such progress, in 1866, Democrats, in conjunction with the city police and the Democratic mayor of New Orleans, attacked the Republican convention in that city, killing 40 blacks, 20 whites, and wounding 150 others. Democrats even rushed the floor of the Louisiana legislature to seize by force the power away from the elected black Republicans, but federal troops arrived to restore peace and return African Americans to their lawfully elected positions. Similarly violent and often deadly attacks by Democrats against Republicans also occurred in other states as well. While much early Democratic opposition occurred on a state-by-state or a local basis, in 1866, Democrats formed a group that became national. Its declared purpose was to break down the Republican government and to pave the way for Democrats to regain control in the elections. What was the name of that group? The Ku Klux Klan. Although it is relatively unreported today, the historical documents are unequivocal that the Klan was started by Democrats and that the Klan played a prominent role in the Democratic Party. This 13-volume set of congressional investigations from 1872 conclusively and irrefutably documents that fact. The Klan terrorized black Americans through murders and public floggings. Relief was granted only if they promised not to vote for Republican tickets, and violation of this oath was punishable by death. And since the Klan was targeted against Republicans in general, it did not limit its violence simply to black Republicans. In this old illustration, the Klan in North Carolina is about to hang a white Republican. This is a Klan push card from 1868, about the size of a baseball card. It is entitled, Radical Members of the South Carolina Legislature. It shows 63 radicals. They were all Republicans. The Democrats called Republicans radicals because the Republican Party was biracial and allowed blacks to vote and participate in the political process, thus making them radical in the Democrats' eyes. Of the 63 radicals, or Republicans, in the South Carolina legislature, 50 were black and 13 were white. On the back of this card, all the names of the radical Republicans were listed. Evidently, if the Klan wanted to pay a night visit, with the help of this card, they would know exactly who they were looking for. Although much progress had been made because of the 13th Amendment and the civil rights laws passed in Congress, Democrats in the South still found ways to ignore those laws. Congress responded with the 14th Amendment, a civil rights amendment to the Constitution declaring that former slaves were full citizens of the state in which they lived and were therefore entitled to all the rights and privileges of any other citizen in that state. When the 14th Amendment came to a vote, 94% of the Republicans in Congress voted for the passage of that civil rights amendment. However, the records of Congress reveal that not one single Democrat in either the House or the Senate voted for the 14th Amendment. Perhaps this lack of support for civil rights is not surprising considering the makeup of the National Democratic Party at that time. Here is a handbill highlighting some of the distinguished notables at the 1868 Democratic National Convention held in New York City on July the 4th of that year. Nearly 1/5 of the members of the Democratic National Convention were leaders who had either militarily fought for or politically led the slaveholding nation in the South. The handbill also featured portraits of two prominent rebel generals who participated in that convention. One was Wade Hampton. Before the war, Hampton had been a Democratic U.S. Senator, but he left the Senate when the Southern Democrats seceded to form their slaveholding nation. In 1876, Hampton ran for the Democratic governorship of South Carolina. One of his active allies in that election was a group called the Red Shirts, which essentially was the Klan dressed in red shirts rather than white hoods. To help win Hampton's governor's race, they issued the following guidelines.
Every Democrat must feel honor-bound to control the vote of at least one Negro by intimidation, purchase, keeping him away, or as each individual may determine how he may best accomplish it. We must attend every Republican meeting that we hear of, whether they eat at night or in the daytime. Democrats must go in as large numbers as they can get together and well armed.
Here's an illustration demonstrating how Democrats controlled votes in elections. Notice the caption. Of course he wants to vote the Democratic ticket. The Democrat Hampton was finally declared the winner and became governor, but only under very questionable circumstances. In fact, the editorial cartoons in Harper's following that election showed a triumphant Democrat standing over the bodies of slaughtered African American voters. The other featured portrait of the 1868 National Democratic delegates was that of Rebel General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was a slave trader from Tennessee and was the rebel general that conducted the massacre of black soldiers in the infamous incident at Fort Pillow. After the war, General Nathan Bedford Forrest became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was an honored leader at the Democratic National Convention of 1868. Given the composition of the Democratic Party, it is no wonder that not one of the Democrats in Congress voted for the 14th Amendment to secure civil rights to black Americans at the state level. Even though huge steps in obtaining civil rights had been achieved through the 13th and the 14th Amendments, as well as through several federal civil rights laws, the staunch and steadfast resistance of the Southern Democratic states to those measures continued. They simply ignored the constitutional amendments and the federal laws. Congress therefore imposed requirements that before the former Confederate states could be readmitted, they must create new state constitutions that guaranteed equal civil rights for black Americans. However, the votes to ratify these new constitutions that granted civil rights to black Americans were met with massive resistance and widespread riots and attacks by Democrats throughout those states. For example, in 1868 in Mississippi, Democrats and the Klan attacked blacks on their way to vote for the new Constitution. As a result, the Congressional Committee on Reconstruction convened extensive hearings. For those who have heard so little of this part of American history, or of this part of African American political history, the hearings provided what perhaps today would be considered shocking information for citizens. Consider, for example, the testimony of election worker Robert Flournoy, given before the committee on December the 15th, 1868.
What means have you had within the last years of knowing the sentiment of the people of Mississippi concerning the Constitution that was framed at the convention?
I canvassed a large portion of the state in favor of the adoption and ratification of the Constitution. Of course, I made it my business to ascertain the sentiment of the people from what I could judge in general from the expressions of approval or disapproval of remarks made. and I took it upon myself to converse freely with the people. I have never met, in all my interaction with the Negroes of Mississippi, but one single Negro who professed to be a Democrat, and that was in the town of Oxford. He was a waiter in a hotel, and he informed me that he was a Democrat. I tried to convert him and failed and left him a Democrat.
This election official could only find one black American in the entire state of Mississippi that was a Democrat. Significantly, in Mississippi at that time, there were 444,000 blacks and only 383,000 whites. Since blacks voted overwhelmingly Republican, only by preventing blacks from voting could Democrats defeat the new state constitution with its civil rights provisions, hence the cause of the violence. Notwithstanding the strident opposition throughout the southern states, the new constitutions were eventually passed, and a number of black Americans were elected to national office under those new constitutions. This 1872 print by Currier and Ives shows the first 7 black Americans elected to the U.S. Congress. Significantly, all 7 were Republicans. On the left side of the picture is Hiram Rhodes Revels from Mississippi. An ordained minister, he served as a missionary and pastor, recruited 3 black regiments, and was a chaplain during the Civil War. Revels became America's first black U.S. Senator. Next is Benjamin Turner of Alabama. Turner was a slave during the Civil War, but within 5 years after the war, he had become a wealthy and prosperous businessman. Next is Robert DeLarge of South Carolina. Born as a slave, within 3 years of the end of the war, he was serving in the State House. He also chaired the Republican Party's platform committee and became a statewide elected official. Next is Josiah Walls of Florida. Walls was a slave during the Civil War and was forced to fight for the Confederate Army. After he was captured by Union troops, however, he promptly enlisted as a Union soldier and even became an officer. After his election to Congress, his credentials were challenged by Democrats and he was twice sent home. He was re-elected after the first challenge, but during the second challenge, Democrats regained control of Florida and he was prevented from returning. Next is Jefferson Long of Georgia. Born as a slave, he was self-educated and built a thriving business. However, when elected to Congress as a Republican, Democrats boycotted his business, causing him great financial losses. Long was the first black American to deliver a congressional speech in the U.S. House. Next is Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina. Born a slave, he actually served briefly as Speaker of the U.S. House and was in Congress longer than any other black American from that era. The 7th is Robert Brown Elliott, also of South Carolina. He was well educated, reading in Spanish, French, and Latin. In Congress, he led in the passage of civil rights bills over the strident opposition of congressional Democrats, and he later became Speaker of the House in the state legislature. Revels took a seat once held by Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, who left the Senate in 1861 and became the president of the slave-holding Confederate States of America. The editorial cartoons of the day did not fail to note the irony that a black Republican senator had taken the same seat once held by racist Democrat Jefferson Davis. Notice all the Republicans gathered around Senator Revels. Who is that skulking in the foreground? Democrat Jefferson Davis, filled with rage and hatred as a black Republican takes his seat. While the Reverend Hiram Rhodes Revels was the first black American to serve in the U.S. Senate, there have been others as well. The second was Blanche Kelso Bruce, the first to serve a full term in the Senate. The third black senator was Edward Brooke. Significantly, the first 3 black U.S. senators, Revels, Bruce, and Brooke, were all Republicans. Carol Moseley Braun of Illinois was the 4th black American to serve in the U.S. Senate, but only the 1st Democrat. And Barack Obama, also from Illinois, was only the 2nd black Democratic U.S. Senator. The first African American elected to the U.S. House was Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina. He was the first of 23 black Americans elected to the U.S. Congress, all as Republicans. Remarkably, of those early black congressmen, 13 had been slaves. Consider the amazing transformation that this represents. In only 5 years, black Americans had gone from being slaves to becoming members of Congress. Not only had 13 of the early black congressmen been slaves, but many were home or self-educated. Additionally, 3 of that group were ministers, 7 were attorneys, 5 were school teachers, 4 were university presidents, and 13 were state legislators, a distinguished group with momentous achievements. Democrats did not elect their first black American to the U.S. House until 1935, and that black member was from Illinois, a northern state in which blacks had always been free. It was not until 1973 that the first black American Democrats were elected to Congress from the South, Barbara Jordan of Texas and Andrew Young of Georgia. And they were elected only after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the gerrymandered district lines that Southern Democratic state legislatures had drawn that kept blacks from being elected. While black Americans immediately following the Civil War had indeed begun a distinguished chapter in their history, the opposition to their rapid success grew just as rapidly as had their successes. Many Southern Democrats despised blacks and Republicans and utilized every means possible to keep them from voting, including not only the use of devious and cunning means, but also the direct use of violence. As a response to Democratic violence in the South, and in order to further secure the civil rights of black Americans, Congress passed the 15th Amendment explicitly guaranteeing voting rights for blacks. Like the 2 previous civil rights amendments, the 15th Amendment was passed also along partisan lines. Not a single one of the 56 Democrats in Congress at that time voted for the 15th Amendment. Not one Democrat, either from the North or the South, supported granting explicit voting rights to black Americans. By 1875, only a decade after the Civil War, Republicans had successfully passed almost 24 civil rights laws, and black American legislators often played significant roles in the debates surrounding the passage of such laws. One example involved a civil rights bill in 1871, a bill allowing the federal government to punish Klan violence. During the debates on that bill, Representative Robert Brown Elliott of South Carolina addressed the issue of Southern violence and delivered a compelling speech.
The purpose of the Democratic Party of the South, as evidenced in the utterances of its recognized writings and leaders, exhibits the declared purpose to defeat the ballot with the bullet and other coercive means. I have presented a few manifold proofs in support of the facts about the Klan. I have shown the declared purpose of the Ku Klux organization, and I refer to the official records of nearly every southern state during the past 10 months to show how that bloody purpose has been in part executed. This bill will tend in some degree to prevent its full achievement. I trust, sir, that this bill will pass quickly and be quickly enforced, lest the Democratic Party of the South triumph through armed violence.
Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey, another member from South Carolina, also delivered a powerful speech during the debates on that bill, explaining why blacks were most often the targets of Klan violence.
When we call to mind the fact that this Klan persecution is waged against men for the simple reason that they dare vote with the Republican Party, the question is sometimes asked, why do not the courts of law afford redress? We answer, because the courts are in many instances under the control of Democrats who are wholly opposed to the impartial administration of law and equity. What benefit would result from appeal to courts whose officers are secretly in sympathy with the very evil against which we are striving? If the Negroes, numbering 1/8 of the population of these United States, would only cast their votes in the interest of the Democrats, all open measures of violence against them would immediately be suspended and their rights as American citizens recognized. But I can only say that we love freedom more, vastly more than slavery. Consequently, we hope to keep clear of the Democrats. I will also say that in the state of South Carolina, which I represent, there is no disturbance of an alarming character in any one of the counties in which the Republicans have a majority. The troubles are usually in those sections in which the Democrats have control. I say to the entire membership of the Democratic Party that upon your hands rests the blood of the loyal men of the South. Disclaim it as you will, but the stain is there to prove your criminality before man and God. in the world in the day of retribution, which will surely come. I pity the man or party of men who would seek to ride into power over the dead body of a legitimate opponent. I can say for my people that we are fully determined to stand by the Republican Party and the government. We have resolved to be loyal and firm, and as Queen Esther said long ago, if we perish, we perish. I earnestly hope that this bill will pass.
That bill did pass, but only over the united opposition of Democrats. In fact, no Democrat, not a single one, either from the North or the South, supported the Civil Rights Bill to punish Klan violence. 4 years later, Black Americans again played a significant role in the debates on a Civil Rights Bill, this time the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 to prohibit segregation and racial discrimination. Following one Democratic tirade against the bill, Representative Robert Brown Elliott rose to respond. It was such a climactic moment that the artists of the day created illustrations depicting the verbal battle that occurred between this black Republican and Democrat Alexander Stephens, who had been the Vice President of the Confederacy and who was a leader of the Democratic arguments on the bill. Elliott's magnificent response did not convert Alexander Stephens or the other Democrats, but it was so eloquent that it silenced them. In fact, the Democrats' rebuttal against Elliott was so weak that the best they could do was to claim that the speech was not really his, that it was so brilliant that someone else must have written it, that surely a black American such as Elliott could not have created such a masterful speech. He so completely befuddled them with his oratorical skills that all they could do was claim that someone else must have written his speech. Representative John Roy Lynch of Mississippi, in closing his speech on the same bill, predicted what he believed would be the outcome of the vote.
In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I say to the Republican members of the House that the passage of this bill is expected by you. If any of our Democratic friends will vote for it, we will be agreeably surprised. But if Republicans should vote against it, we will be sorely disappointed. But I have no fears whatever in this respect. Republicans have stood by the colored people of this country when it was more unpopular to do so than it is to pass this bill. You have fulfilled every promise thus far, and I have no reason to believe that you will not fulfill this one.
That Civil Rights Bill did pass, but regrettably, Representative Lynch did not receive the surprise he had hoped for. It was exactly as he had suspected. While Republicans overwhelmingly supported the bill, not a single one of the 114 Democrats in Congress voted for that Civil Rights Bill. That Civil Rights Bill, like the others, was passed by Republicans over strident and virtually unanimous opposition of Democrats. That 1875 Civil Rights Bill was the last of the almost 24 civil rights bills passed by Republicans. In fact, following the passage of that 1875 bill, it would be nearly 90 years before the next civil rights law was passed. Why did the rapid progress come to an abrupt halt after 1875? Because in 1876, Democrats gained control of the U.S. House for the first time since 1861. Therefore, with the divided Congress, Democrats successfully blocked any further progress in the civil rights arena. Facing such strident and irrational Democrat obstructionists, the enthusiasm for fighting in that arena soon waned and civil rights momentum was lost. However, not only did Democrats gain the U.S. House in 1876, but they were able to bring Reconstruction to a close by having all federal troops withdrawn from the South, thus removing the final protective barrier between black Americans and those Democrats aggressively seeking to violate their newfound civil rights. From that point forward, the South became known as the, quote, solid Democratic South. Southern state legislatures were again solidly in the hands of Democrats, and white supremacy in the South was reestablished, barring Southern blacks from federal elective offices for an additional 70 years. Returning to 1876, public debate began to focus on issues that had already been raised in earlier civil rights laws and issues that Democrats were now trying to reverse, issues such as education. For example, this piece, entitled Politics and the School Question, Attitude of the Republican and Democratic parties in 1876, examined the contrasting positions of the two parties on the issue of education. The Republicans had supported public education for all children, regardless of race, but Democrats not only opposed public education for all children, but in fact strongly supported segregated education.
For example, this is a published and widely distributed pro-segregation speech by Democratic Congressman James Harper of North Carolina. Notice its title, Separate Schools for Whites and Colored with Equal Advantages. Mixed schools? Never. Similarly, in 1875, the Democratic Executive Committee of Ohio issued this piece on public education to, as they said, expose the tricks of the Republican Executive Committee. What were the so-called dirty tricks of Republicans to which Democrats objected? And what was intended to be an insult about Republicans?
The only positive action of the Republican Party on the school question in Ohio is to destroy the system by requiring that whites and blacks be educated together.
The Democratic response against open education for black youth sometimes went beyond words to acts of violence, such as when they burned down 8 schools in Memphis in which black youth were being taught. Additionally, since churches in the South frequently provided education for youth, such as St. Philip's Church in Richmond, churches were also frequently burned down. And this is a flyer distributed by the Klan in North Carolina showing a school teacher being stripped and beaten. That flyer, distributed to teachers, warned, Miss Whoever, we send you a picture of the way we treated a Yankee school ma'am in this county last year. Beware lest you share the same fate. Black leaders understood that good education was important not only to black Americans, but also to the future of the country. Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey, speaking on a bill to strengthen the education system for all students, including young black students, wisely reminded the opposing Democrats,
I shall remind the House of one thing more. The youth now springing up to manhood will be the future lawmakers and rulers of our country. That they should be intelligent and thoroughly educated is a prime necessity and of great importance, which is admitted by all and denied by none. All that may be done with this end in view will be returned with an increased interest. I truly hope that those Democrats who oppose this bill will reconsider their opposition and give it their vote when the question shall again be before the House. For one, I shall give it my hearty support, believing it to be just and beneficial in its provisions.
Unfortunately, 87% of the Democrats in Congress at that time voted against that education bill. Segregated, inferior, and dilapidated schools for blacks became the norm in the southern states under Democratic control. In 1954, the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education finally struck down state segregation laws in education, thus reinstating what Republicans had done nearly 75 years earlier in the 1875 Civil Rights Bill. What was the Southern Democratic response to the court decision finally ending segregated education? There was a twofold response, one of words and one of actions. In the category of words, 100 Democrats in Congress, 19 senators and 81 representatives, passed the Southern Manifesto denouncing the court's decision to end segregation. Those 100 Democrats declared in 1956 that desegregation was, quote, certain to destroy the system of public education, and that there would be what they called an explosive and dangerous condition created by this decision. Mississippi Democratic Governor James Coleman, when asked in an interview on Meet the Press whether the public schools of Mississippi would ever be integrated, succinctly replied, I would say that a baby born in Mississippi today will never live long enough to see an integrated school. In 1956, Democratic Governor Alan Shivers of Texas deployed the Texas Rangers to keep blacks from entering schools in Mansfield. The following year, 1957, Democratic Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas called out the National Guard to keep black students from entering Central High School in Little Rock. Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower quickly intervened, and he federalized the Arkansas National Guard to take it away from Governor Faubus. Eisenhower then replaced the Arkansas Guard with 1,200 troops from the elite 101st Airborne Division, ordering them to protect the 9 black students who had chosen to go to Central High. Democrats in the U.S. Senate strongly protested against Eisenhower's actions to protect these black students. Georgia Democratic Governor Marvin Griffin also attacked Eisenhower's actions and promised that as long as he held office, he would, quote, maintain segregation in the schools and the races will not be mixed come hell or high water, end quote. To prepare for the possibility that Eisenhower might do in Georgia what he had done in Arkansas, legislation was introduced in the democratically controlled Georgia legislature so that if desegregation was attempted, the public schools of the state would be dissolved and replaced with state-run private schools so that blacks could be excluded. These types of schools became known as segregation academies. Meanwhile, in Arkansas, Democratic Governor Faubus, unable to prevent black students from attending school because of the federal protection they had received, simply shut down the schools for the next year to prevent further attendance. And Virginia Democratic Governor James Almond, like other Southern Democratic governors, also shut down public schools rather than permit black students to attend. In 1960 in Louisiana, where Democratic Governor Jimmy Davis supported segregation, it required 4 federal marshals to accompany little Ruby Bridges so she could attend a public elementary school in New Orleans. When Ruby entered that school, every other parent in that school pulled their children out of the school, and for the entire year, little Ruby was the only student in that school building, just Ruby and her school teacher from Boston. So deep-seated was the racism among Southern Democratic leaders that when the 1964 Civil Rights Bill became law, Lester Maddox, who became Democratic governor of Georgia, sold the fast food business that he owned rather than serve blacks in his restaurant. And in 1960, Mississippi Democratic Governor Hugh White even requested that evangelist Billy Graham segregate his crusades, something Graham refused to do. In fact, when South Carolina Democratic Governor George Timmerman learned that Billy Graham had invited African Americans to a Reformation rally at the South Carolina State Capitol, he promptly denied use of the facilities to the evangelist. This type of democratic response against black Americans and the whites who supported them was common across much of the South. And the reasons given by Democratic leaders to justify this disgusting behavior was simply states' rights. The same rhetoric they had used a century earlier, first to justify slavery and the creation of a slaveholding nation, and then to enact laws enforcing segregation and withholding voting rights from black Americans for the next 80 years after the Civil War. Returning to the school desegregation situation, some Democratic Southern governors did work for integration, including Tennessee Governor Frank Clement, Florida Governor Leroy Collins, and Kentucky Governor Happy Chandler. But these tended to be the exceptions among Southern Democratic governors rather than the rule, and their admirable behavior was clearly overshadowed by the negative behavior of the others. Democratic leaders long stood in the doorways of schoolhouses and told black children, "We don't want you in here to get the good education that our children are getting." Today, as many black students have become mired in urban schools that are often failing or deteriorating, Democrats are once again standing in the doorway. Consider the situation in Washington, D.C., where 84% of the city's students are black. Despite the fact that nearly $13,500 is spent each year on every student in the district, an amount almost twice the national average of $7,500 per student, D.C. schools currently rank among the worst of all schools in the nation. Congress therefore moved to provide help by providing a $7,500 voucher for low-income students who are trapped in failing schools, a voucher they can redeem to attend a better school, a school chosen by that student and his or her parents. When that congressional proposal came to a vote, only 1% of Democrats in Congress supported vouchers and parental choice in education, even though nationally, nearly 70% of African Americans with children support educational choice. While Democrats once stood in the doorways of public schools and told black students, "We don't want you in here," they're again standing in the doorways of public schools, this time telling black students that they don't want them out, that they want them to remain in failing schools. It appears that for a century and a half, Democrats have often taken wrong positions on educational opportunity for black Americans. Returning back to the 19th century, Representative John Roy Lynch, a congressman from Mississippi, was mentioned earlier. He had grown up as a slave until freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Within a decade, he had become Speaker of the House in Mississippi and later received presidential appointments from Republican Presidents Benjamin Harrison and William McKinley. Lynch was appointed an Army officer during the Spanish-American War, earned a law degree, and was the chairman of the Republican Party in Mississippi. He was a leader who served his state and his nation well. In 1884, John Roy Lynch became the first black American to preside over a national political convention, the Republican National Convention in Chicago. Lynch's love for his country was still very evident and reflected the patriotism still evident among African Americans today.
I love the land that gave me birth. I love the stars and stripes. This country is where I intend to live, where I expect to die, to preserve the honor of the national flag, and to maintain perpetually the union of the states. Hundreds, and I may say thousands of noble, brave, and true-hearted colored men have fought, bled, and died.
While Lynch was the first black American to preside over a national political convention, he was not the last. U.S. Senator Edward Brooke presided over the 1968 National Republican Convention, and Representative J.C. Watts presided over the 2000 National Republican Convention. While 3 black Americans have presided over national conventions for Republicans, to date, Democrats have never had a black American preside over any of their national Democratic conventions. Following the removal of federal troops from the South after the agreement of 1876, Republicans sought different means to try to secure the rights of black Americans in the South. For example, Republicans posted handbills such as this one from 1880, reminding Southern Democrats first of the federal laws protecting black voting rights and then warning of huge fines for violations. The presidential election of that year, of 1880, was between Republican James A. Garfield and Northern Democrat Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock had been a successful Union general during the Civil War, but after the war, he was reassigned because of his leniency toward unreconstructed Democrats. Recall that Northern or Union Democrats, such as Hancock, sought to preserve the Union, but not to end slavery or to grant equality to African Americans. Since Hancock was a Democrat, even though he had fought for the Union, this 1880 piece reminded citizens why they should not vote Democratic in that election. The reasons given in this piece would be considered strong language today. At that time, however, they were nothing more than reminders. The facts recorded in this piece were widely known and understood by voters in that day.
Why I will not vote the Democratic ticket. I am opposed to the Democratic Party, and I will tell you why. Every state that seceded from the United States was a Democratic state. Every man that shot Union soldiers was a Democrat. Every man that loved slavery better than liberty was a Democrat. The man that assassinated Abraham Lincoln was a Democrat. Every man that sympathized with the assassin, every man glad that the noblest president ever elected was assassinated, was a Democrat. Every man that wept over the corpse of slavery was a Democrat. Every man that cursed Lincoln because he issued the Proclamation of Emancipation, the grandest paper since the Declaration of Independence, every one of them was a Democrat. Soldiers, every sear you have got on your heroic bodies was given you by a Democrat. Every sear, every arm that is lacking, every limb that is gone, every sear is a souvenir of a Democrat.
That broadside then contrasted the Republicans with the Democrats.
The Republicans have done some noble things, things that will be remembered as long as there is history. But there are some things they did not do. They did not use an army to force slavery into Kansas. They were not Knights of the Golden Circle. They did not oppose emancipation. They were not Ku Klux. They did not scourge and hang and shoot and murder men for opinion's sake. They did not organize the Louisiana White League or the South Carolina Rifle Clubs. They did not drench the South with the blood of inoffensive colored men.
The piece concluded with a simple question.
Can the Democratic Party and all Democrats say as much?
A further indication that the Democrats were well known for their bloody atrocities against blacks is seen in this illustration from Harper's Weekly showing the major elements and influences of the Democratic Party. The illustration shows the various banners under which Democrats gathered, and those banners included the stars and bars carried by Confederate soldiers, the pro-slavery banner, the Ku Klux Klan banner, the New York rioters banner, referring to the massive riots instigated against blacks by the Democrats in New York, leading to the killing and injuring of as many as 1,000 citizens. And finally, the Democratic banner of repudiation, referring to the Democrats' opposition to paying the national debt incurred in putting down the Southern pro-slavery rebellion. These were the various movements led by Democrats, and Americans in that day knew what Democrats stood for. By the 1880s, a movement called Southern Redemption had begun in earnest. Southern Redemption was a political movement to redeem the South from the Reconstruction Acts and the civil rights laws passed by Republicans, laws and acts that Southern Democrats believed threatened their version of a Southern society. The best way for the Democratic legislatures to redeem their state was to deprive black Americans of their political rights through the passage of state laws that restricted, removed, or even blatantly violated their civil rights, as well as through the prompt repeal of state laws that had suppressed Klan violence. Representative John Roy Lynch, who not only had helped pass the original federal civil rights laws, but who also witnessed their subsequent violation at the state level throughout the period of Southern Redemption, accurately noted,
"The opposition to civil rights in the South is confined almost exclusively to states under Democratic control."
Democrats understood how important it was to their survival to prevent blacks from voting. In fact, this illustration from that period shows an allegory of the Bible story of Samson, who lost his strength when his hair was cut. In the picture, you see that the woman has used her razor, called the Lost Cause Regained, to cut the black Samson's hair and cause him to lose his strength. And what is his hair? His strength? It is called suffrage, or voting. With the strength, or the vote, of black Americans removed, you see the various Democratic groups and leaders rejoicing in the background, including Confederates, the KKK, pro-slavery forces, and various famous Democratic leaders of that day, including General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who headed the Ku Klux Klan. By the way, notice the phrase, the Democratic barbecue, and that Democrats are burning various books in the foreground, including the Holy Bible. As this illustration confirms, limiting black voting became the major goal for Southern Democrats. Given the explicit federal voting protections that had been established by the 14th and 15th Amendments and by the numerous federal civil rights laws, it was no easy task for Democrats to circumvent these protections. It required devious and cunning methods, and Southern Democratic legislatures implemented almost a dozen separate devices to keep blacks from voting. The first device was the poll tax, a fee paid by a voter before he could vote. The fee was high enough that most poor were unable to pay the tax and therefore were unable to vote. And while some Southern whites were poor, nearly all Southern blacks were poor, having just emerged from slavery and not yet having established an independent means of living. Literacy tests were the second means that Democrats used to disenfranchise blacks. Literacy tests required a voter to demonstrate a certain level of specific knowledge before he could vote. In some cases, the test was 20 pages long for blacks, and those administering the test were white Democrats who nearly always ruled that blacks were illiterate. Grandfather clauses were the third device used to disenfranchise black Americans, allowing only those individuals to vote whose father or grandfather had been registered to vote prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment. This law ensured that poor and illiterate whites could vote, but not blacks. The fourth device was suppressive election procedures. This included the use of multiple ballots. That is, a Republican voter might be required to cast a ballot in up to 8 separate locations, or sometimes to vote for each individual Republican on a ballot at a separate location before the ballot would be counted. Democratic officials often failed to inform black voters of this complicated procedure, and their ballots were therefore disqualified. Democrats also used what were called hide-and-seek polling places, moving voting boxes to unknown locations at the last minute and then posting armed guards in case any blacks should stumble upon the voting box. The fifth device included the use of so-called black codes, later called Jim Crow laws, to restrict the freedoms and economic opportunities of blacks. Representative Robert Brown Elliott reported,
among the first acts of legislation adopted by the Southern Democratic states were laws which imposed upon the colored race oppressive disabilities and burdens and curtailed their rights in the pursuit of life, liberty, and property to such an extent that their freedom was of little value. Colored citizens were in some states forbidden to even appear in town. They were required to reside on and cultivate the soil without the right to purchase or own it. They were excluded from many occupations, and they were not permitted to testify in any court where a white man was a party.
National observers at that time concluded that the Democratic South was simply trying to institute a new form of slavery through the use of these black codes. Representative Richard Kane of South Carolina agreed.
When the government of the United States had made the black man free, when Congress, in the greatness of its majesty, prepared to give to every class of men their rights, and in reconstructing the southern states, guaranteed to all the people their liberties, Democrats refused to agree to the laws enacted by Congress. You Democrats refused to, and I quote, accept the situation. To recognize the rights of that class of men in this land, you sought to make the Reconstruction Acts a nullity, if possible. You sought to re-enslave the black man by every means in your power.
Southern Democrats went well beyond black codes, however, and also imposed forced segregation. Those Democratic pro-segregation state laws replaced the anti-segregation federal laws passed by Republicans in 1875, and regrettably, those state laws became the legal standard for the next 75 years. The sixth device to disenfranchise black voters was bizarre gerrymandering. Once Democrats regained state legislatures, they began to redraw election lines to make it impossible for Republicans to be elected, thereby preventing blacks from being elected. For example, after Reconstruction, Democrats regained the legislature and began to redraw voting lines so that when the last African American left the Texas State House in 1897, not another one was elected, either as a Republican or a Democrat, for the next 70 years until federal courts struck down the way Texas Democrats drew voting lines. This pattern was typical in other southern states as well. The seventh device used to disenfranchise black voters was that of white-only primaries. When the U.S. Supreme Court finally struck down the state law in 1927, the Democratic Party simply enacted internal Democratic Party policies to prevent blacks from voting in Democratic primaries. And because Democrats at that time solidly controlled every level of government in the South, this Democratic Party policy had the same effect as a state law and thus ensured that no black would be elected. In 1935, the Supreme Court upheld this Democratic Party policy of white-only primaries, but in 1944 the court reversed itself and finally struck them down. The eighth device used by Democrats to disenfranchise black Americans was that of physical intimidation and violence. Obviously, the Ku Klux Klan was a leader in this form of violent voter intimidation. As confirmed by Representative James T. Rapier of Alabama,
Democrats were hunting me down like the partridge on the mount, night and day, with their Ku Klux Klan, simply because I was a Republican and refused to bow at the feet of their Baal.
the ninth device used by Democrats to disenfranchise black voters was the revision of state constitutions to negate many of the rights that had been gained. Other devices employed by Democrats to keep blacks from voting included property ownership requirements. Democrats also used restrictive eligibility requirements, such as residing in a state 2 years before voting, or the paying of excessive annual voter registration fees, fees not struck down by the courts until 1971. Democrats utilized nearly a dozen devices to keep black Americans from voting, something that would have come as no surprise to the earliest African-American civil rights leaders. For example, Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey had earlier declared,
"You cannot expect the Negro to rise while the Democrats are trampling upon him and his rights. We ask you, sir, to do by the Negro as you ought to do by him in justice. If the Democrats are such staunch friends of the Negro, why is it that when new propositions are offered here and elsewhere, looking into the elevation of the colored race and the extension of right and justice to them, why do the Democrats array themselves in unbroken ranks and vote against every such measure?"
Frederick Douglass agreed with Rainey and also confirmed basic Democratic hostility for those civil rights. Douglass had explained,
"In all the southern states, the 14th and 15th Amendments of the Constitution are practically of no force or effect. By means of the shotgun and midnight raid, the old master class has triumphed over the newly enfranchised citizen and put the Constitution under their feet. The colored people, who largely outnumber the whites and who are Republican in politics, have been banished from the ballot box and robbed of representation in the councils of the nation. And the social condition of the colored people in that section is but little above what it was in the time of slavery."
The unrelenting Democratic efforts to suppress black voting were successful. For example, in Mississippi in 1892, there were almost 70,000 more blacks than whites in the state. Yet white voters outnumbered black voters by a margin of 8-1. And in Birmingham, of the 18,000 blacks who lived in that city at the turn of the century, only 30 were eligible to vote. In Texas, the number of black voters fell from 100,000 to only 5,000. The number of black voters in Alabama and Florida was reduced by nearly 90%. And by the 1940s, only 5% of blacks in the South were registered to vote. In fact, in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, a city with more black residents than white residents, the voting rolls were 99% white and only 1% black. Clearly, Democratic voter suppression efforts had been successful. Returning to the 1800s, recall that Democrats regained partial control of Congress in 1876. That partial control continued for the next 16 years until 1893, when Democrat Grover Cleveland was elected as president, and Democrats gained control of both the House and the Senate. For the first time since Abraham Lincoln, the Democrats had full control of the lawmaking process. Given their new powers, what did Democrats do to assist civil rights? Nothing. Not a single civil rights law was passed by Democrats during that time. In fact, the Democrats immediately passed laws repealing civil rights laws that had not yet been struck down by the Supreme Court. Specifically, Democrats repealed the laws protecting black voting rights as well as those punishing Klan violence. By 1900, Democrats actually began actively to seek the repeal of the 14th and 15th Amendments. As Democratic Senator Ben Tillman from South Carolina explained,
"We made up our minds that the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were themselves null and void, that the Civil Rights Acts of Congress were null and void, that oaths required by such laws were null and void."
In 1901, at the same time that Democrats were seeking to roll back the Civil Rights Amendments to the Constitution, Republican President Teddy Roosevelt raised the ire of many Democrats by inviting Booker T. Washington to the White House. And Washington became the first African American to dine with the president at the White House. While Booker T. Washington's wise counsel was snubbed by Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, it was gladly sought by 3 Republican presidents for whom he served as advisor, including William Taft, William McKinley, and Teddy Roosevelt. In 1915, the pro-Klan movie, Birth of a Nation, was released. It became a recruiting tool to help the Klan reach its peak membership of almost 2 million. That film incorporated material from Democrat Woodrow Wilson's History of the American People, including Wilson's latent support for the Klan and its abominable practice of Southern redemption. President Woodrow Wilson even showed this racist Klan recruiting film at the White House, the first film ever shown at the White House. Wilson also enacted pro-segregation policies within his administration. By the way, much attention has been focused in state and federal legislatures on reparations proposals, that is, on the seeking of government payments to African Americans for the historical violation of their civil rights. Yet given the political history of African Americans, it might be much more appropriate if those demands for reparations were made to the Democrat Party rather than to the federal government. Returning to the historical timeline, by 1932, Republican Herbert Hoover had finished his first term as president and was running for re-election. His challenger was Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In that election, Roosevelt, in an unusual move, invited black Americans to vote Democratic in the elections. Roosevelt understood his party, however, and made only subtle overtures to black Americans while avoiding any overt civil rights promises. So how did black Americans respond to Roosevelt's invitation to join the Democrats? They printed and distributed this handbill. At the bottom, its caption reads, "Who's a Democrat?" Most would assume this statement to be a question. However, it's not. It's a declaration rather than a question. Notice the exclamation mark rather than the question mark at the end of the caption. So what statement was being made here about the Democrats? A young black boy gazing prayerfully up toward heaven as if seeking hope or help. At his foot is a newspaper. Notice the title on the paper. Lynch, 2 more in Florida. That headline referred to 2 recent lynchings in Florida, those of Richard and Charles Smoke on August the 28th, 1931. For black Americans in that day, reminding them of lynchings was enough said about Democrats. Of all forms of violent intimidation, lynchings were by far the most effective. Between 1882 and 1964, 4,743 individuals were lynched, 3,446 blacks and 1,297 whites. Republicans often led the efforts to pass federal anti-lynching laws, and their platforms consistently called for a ban on lynching. But Democrats successfully blocked those bills, and the Democratic platforms never did condemn lynchings. Many alive today still vividly remember those horrid occurrences, and many were personally and directly impacted by lynchings. One such individual is the Reverend Charles Jackson of Houston. Reverend Jackson is well known across the nation as one of its most successful ministers. He was the first pastor in America, the first pastor of any color, to be nationally televised from the pulpit on a weekly basis. He also built a large, successful megachurch in Houston, the Pleasant Grove Missionary Baptist Church, with more than 5,000 families. Pastor Jackson has preached across the world, has helped start hundreds of churches in America and abroad, and has traveled to foreign nations in company with the U.S. President. But Reverend Jackson's beginnings were very humble. He was raised in East Texas. One night, a terrified young black boy came running up to their house. Pastor Jackson's grandfather went out onto the front porch to defend the young man.
What's going on, son?
They after me. They gonna string me up, that's what they gonna do.
Simmer down, get on in here, come on.
Look,
Give me a piece of this ride bar.
I can't stay here with you.
We'll see who get a face full of buckshot.
I can't put you through this. Look, they'll kill me, and they'll burn your house down and everybody in it. I gotta go.
Son, come back.
Come on, nigga. Come on, boy. Here we go. What's up, man? Come on, boy. Hey, where are you? Come on, boy. We got a necktie party for you. Come on, boy. Now you had. Come on, boy. Well, look at here what I got. Look at this, boy. Take a look at that. I got it. I got you. Hey, be still, boy. Be still.
How has Pastor Jackson handled this incident that so early shaped his own life and that of his family? In the same way that so many others from that era and from previous eras handled the problem, relying on their faith in God which has always been at the core of the African American community, they forgave their tormentors and oppressors. Understandably, these events etched vivid, indelible pictures in the mind of Pastor Jackson's mother, who had witnessed the lynching and whose own sister had been raped and murdered by the mob. Mrs. Jackson later became pregnant, but did not know at that time whether her unborn child was a boy or a girl. Nevertheless, she faithfully prayed over that unborn child every day.
Lord, if this baby be a boy, don't let him hang from a bridge.
That unborn child for whom she faithfully prayed was Pastor Jackson. The Reverend Richard Allen, like so many black Americans before and after him, provides an excellent example. He had been a slave in Delaware, and while only a boy, he was sold separately from his mother, whom he never saw again. While still a slave, Allen became a Christian and began to preach on his and on neighboring plantations. He eventually obtained his freedom, served in the American Revolution, became a minister, and then founded the AME denomination. Despite the grief and tragedy that he had personally experienced in his own life, he understood that bitterness only harms one of the two parties involved, and quite frankly, it harms the innocent party rather than the guilty one. Therefore, Reverend Allen wisely admonished those who had been mistreated.
Let no rancor or ill will lodge in your heart for any bad treatment you may have received from any. If you do, you transgress against God, who will not hold you guiltless. He would not suffer it even in his beloved people, Israel. And you think he will allow it unto us? I am sorry to say that too many think more of the evil than of the good they have received.
Reverend Jackson, like so many black Americans before and after him, followed the teachings of Christianity and forgave his persecutors, holding no bitterness or ill will even to this day. Many today are unaware of how much pain there was and how real lynching was in recent generations still alive right now. Recall from the lynching numbers that even though almost 5,000 Americans were lynched, black Americans were lynched at a rate almost 3 times higher than whites. Why? According to Representative John Roy Lynch,
more colored than white men are thus persecuted simply because they constitute in larger numbers the opposition to the Democratic Party.
Representative Richard Kane agreed.
The bad blood of the South comes because the Negroes are Republicans. If they would only cease to be Republicans and vote the straight-out Democratic ticket, there would be no trouble. Then the bad blood would just sink entirely out of sight.
While the opposition of Democrats to African Americans was vividly demonstrated by lynchings, that opposition went beyond lynchings and included every possible form of obstruction to civil rights in general. This fact is widely known by black Americans, as confirmed by Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey.
You gentlemen on the Democratic side of the House have voted against all the amendments of the Constitution and the civil rights laws enforcing the same. Why did you do it? I answer because those measures had a tendency to give the poor Negro his just rights and give him freedom of speech, freedom of action, and the opportunity for education, that he might elevate himself to the dignity of manhood. Now you come and say to us that you are our best friends. We would that we could look upon you as such. We would that your votes recorded from day to day only demonstrated. But your votes and your actions prove to the Negroes of the entire country that the Democrats are in opposition to them. And if the Democrats could have their way, our race would have no foothold here. The Democratic Party may woo us. They may court us and try to get us to worship at their shrine. But I will tell the gentlemen that we are Republicans by instinct. And we will be Republicans as long as God will allow our proper senses to hold sway over us.
Frederick Douglass agreed. In fact, he recommended,
Each colored voter of the state should say in scripture phrase, "May my hand forget its cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if ever I raise my voice or give my vote for the nominees of the Democratic Party."
Given the long historical record of Democrats opposing black Americans prior to 1932, it was amazing that in that election that Roosevelt should reach out for black votes. So this handbill, to remind black voters of who the Democrats were, simply reminded them of lynchings. Not surprisingly then, in that 1932 presidential election, incumbent Republican President Herbert Hoover received more than 3/4 of the black vote over Democratic challenger Franklin D. Roosevelt. Despite the strong and united opposition of black Americans, Roosevelt narrowly won that election, and he did genuinely begin to try to make some changes in the direction of his Democratic Party. And it was under Roosevelt that Democrats, for the very first time, placed language in their platform calling for an end to racial discrimination. Yet despite the new language in their platform, Democrats in Congress still killed every piece of civil rights legislation introduced in that era. A Democratic leader much more courageous than Franklin Roosevelt was President Harry S. Truman, perhaps the first national Democratic leader vigorously to advocate for strong civil rights protections. Despite his noble goals, Truman, like FDR before him, learned that it was difficult for rank-and-file Democrats to reshape their long-held views on race. The depth of this Democratic opposition was apparent in Texas, when Democratic candidate for governor, Ma Ferguson, dared to criticize the Klan's role in the Southern Democratic Party. She was directly opposed in the Democratic primary with a Klan candidate, thus costing her the widespread cohesive support of the Texas Democratic Party. In fact, a number of Klansmen ran on the various Democratic tickets in that era and were elected. Despite the existence of the Klan and other racist groups within the Democratic Party, Truman worked boldly and openly to change his party. In 1946, he became the first modern president to institute a comprehensive review of race relations, and he introduced an aggressive 10-point civil rights legislative package that included an anti-lynching law, a ban on the poll tax, and desegregation of the military. But Democrats, again, killed all of his proposals, including his proposed Civil Rights Commission. The president following Democrat Harry Truman was World War II hero, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected in 1952. Eisenhower was well aware of the Southern Democratic congressional commitment to racial segregation. Understanding that it would be difficult to make substantial changes in law and that the progress would be slow at best, Eisenhower determined to eliminate racial discrimination in all areas under his authority. He therefore issued executive orders halting segregation in the District of Columbia, the military, and federal agencies. Furthermore, he was the first president to appoint a black American, Frederick Morrow, to an executive position on the White House staff. And although he also proposed a vigorous civil rights legislative protection plan for blacks in the Southern Democratic states, Democrats in Congress were able to prevent any legislative progress. Given his pro-civil rights record, it is not surprising that in his 1956 re-election, Eisenhower, like Republican presidents before him, received significant support from black voters. After his re-election, Eisenhower continued his civil rights efforts. In 1957, he proposed a bold civil rights bill to increase black voting rights and protections, proposals promptly blocked by Democratic Senator James Eastland of Mississippi, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. In fact, Eastland is credited with killing every civil rights bill that came before his committee in the 1950s, and his committee was literally known as the burial ground for civil rights legislation in the U.S. Senate. The stiff Democratic opposition in the Senate resulted in a very watered-down version of Eisenhower's original bill. Yet despite the fact that the bill was much weaker than introduced, Eisenhower did succeed in creating a civil rights division within the U.S. Justice Department, as had earlier been proposed by his predecessor, President Truman. This division subsequently played a prominent role in helping secure civil rights in the South during the 1960s and 1970s. That law also started a Civil Rights Commission that became instrumental in publicizing the effects of Southern segregation and racial oppression. In 1959, Eisenhower presented a second civil rights bill to Congress. That bill was met with unyielding opposition in the House by Democratic Representative Howard Smith of Virginia, chairman of the House Rules Committee. In fact, Smith would actually disappear from Congress for weeks on end simply to keep his committee from acting on the Civil Rights Bill. Democratic House member Emanuel Seller of New York, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, exerted extraordinary effort to move the bill forward even though he was strongly opposed by other members within his own party. When the bill finally passed the House and arrived in the Senate, it was gutted by Democrats before being passed into law, once again preventing the federal government from intervening on behalf of black Americans whose civil rights were being violated in the South. Democrat John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. Following the violent racial discord in Birmingham in 1963, Kennedy did send a major civil rights bill to Congress, a bill based on the findings of Eisenhower's 1957 Civil Rights Commission. Kennedy worked aggressively for the passage of that civil rights bill, but was tragically assassinated before he could see its success. Democratic successor Lyndon Johnson picked up the civil rights measure, but like his predecessors, he faced stiff opposition from his own party. In fact, Democratic Senators Robert Byrd of West Virginia and Richard Russell of Georgia led the opposition against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, including lengthy and extended filibuster speeches. Republican Senator Everett Dirksen resurrected language proposed by Eisenhower's Attorney General in 1960, thus breaking the filibuster of the Civil Rights Bill and allowing Johnson to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Perhaps the most recognizable civil rights leader of that era was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Like Frederick Douglass, the great civil rights leader of the previous century, Dr. King was also a Christian minister of the gospel. He was with President Johnson when the famous Civil Rights Bill was signed into law. These two important civil rights acts were signed into law under a Democratic president, but it was the Republicans in Congress who made possible the passage of both acts, for Johnson had been unable to garner sufficient Democratic support to pass either bill. At that time, Democrats had 315 members in Congress, almost two-thirds of the House and two-thirds of the Senate. President Johnson needed only a simple majority, only 269 votes to get those bills passed. But out of the 315 Democrats, only 198 voted for the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Democrats had it completely within their power to pass those bills, but they did not. Republicans overwhelmingly came to the aid of Democrat President Johnson. If not for the strong support of Republicans, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 would never have become law, not to mention the fact that the heart of both bills came from the work of Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Other significant progress in civil rights had also been made in 1964. For in addition to the Civil Rights Act, it was that same year that the passage of the 24th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing the poll tax had occurred. Significantly, a repeal of the poll tax had been proposed on at least 14 previous occasions, and on 5 of those occasions, the House had actually passed a ban, but each time the Senate Democrats had kept the poll tax alive. It was nearly 85 years after the first poll tax was instituted by Democrats before the ban on the poll tax was finally approved by the Senate. And of the 16 senators who wanted to keep the poll tax alive, 15 of them were Democrats. The positive impact of these changes was both obvious and immediate. Within a year, 450,000 new Southern blacks were successfully registered to vote. In Mississippi, voter registration of black Americans rose from only 5% in 1960 to 60% by 1968, and the number of blacks serving in federal and state legislatures rose from only 2 in 1965 to 160 by 1990. African Americans made their earliest and some of their most significant political and civil rights gains while affiliated with the Republican Party, and that progress is still continuing in this generation. Consider the Texas election in which African American Ron Kirk, former mayor of Dallas, was running for a U.S. Senate seat. When Kirk lost that election, voices across the nation asserted that the South was still too racist to elect a minority on a statewide ballot. What they failed to mention was that in that same election, 3 African Americans were elected to statewide office on the very same statewide ballot as Kirk. But those 3 were elected as Republicans rather than Democrats. Apparently, Texas became the first state in American history to elect 3 black Americans to statewide office.
but since they were all Republicans, that story simply was not reported. And in that same election cycle, black Americans were elected to statewide office in other states as well, including a black lieutenant governor in Ohio and another in Maryland, both as Republicans. An important point is illustrated by these recent elections and by scores before them. In democratically controlled states, rarely are African Americans elected statewide, with the exception of U.S. senators in Illinois and a governor in Virginia. And most African American Democratic members of Congress usually are elected only from minority districts. That is, Democratic districts where minority voters make the majority, rather than where there's a Democratic majority of white voters. On the other hand, African American Republicans are usually elected statewide in Republican states or in congressional districts with large white majorities, such as when J.C. Watts was elected to Congress as a Republican in a district with only 9% African American voters. Perhaps this explains why Frederick Douglass, a century ago, reminded black Americans,
for colored voters, the Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea.
The political history of African Americans has often proved Douglass right. Yet no one from any background, whether a political, religious, or racial background, should ever love any political party above principle. Although history is clear that there have been major differences in how political parties treated black Americans, neither party is completely blameless in all of its actions, nor have all the leaders in a party always been good or always been bad. Understanding this truth, Representative Robert Brown Elliott, even though he was a strong Republican leader in his day, wisely advised,
I am a slave to principles. I call no political party master. I have ever most sincerely embraced the democratic and representative ideal, not indeed as represented or professed by any political party, but by its true significance, as transfigured in the Declaration of Independence and in the injunctions of Christianity.
Elliott's admonition is wise. Align with political candidates that conform to what he called the injunctions of Christianity. Republican Frederick Douglass, who served as a minister of the gospel, had agreed, declaring,
I have one great political idea. That idea is an old one, is widely and generally assented to. Nevertheless, is very generally trampled upon and disregarded. The best expression of it I found in the Bible. It is, in substance, righteousness exalteth a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. Proverbs 14:34. Now this constitutes my politics, the negative and positive of my politics, and the whole of my politics. I feel it my duty to do all in my power to infuse this idea into the public mind that it may be practiced.
Douglass was right. As citizens, we must vote righteously. And by the way, this first assumes that we are voting. This responsibility to vote and to vote righteously has been made clear from generation to generation. One such voice heralding this responsibility was that of Charles Finney. Finney was a famous American revivalist, a leader in the American revival movement called the Second Great Awakening. He was also the president of a college that even decades before the Civil War admitted both black and white students as equals. In fact, the students from the college where Reverend Finney was president not only became some of the most active conductors of the Underground Railroad, but also started several of America's black colleges and universities. Reverend Finney wisely admonished,
the time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this manner, but the time has come when they must act differently. Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics, but I tell you, He does see it, and He will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics.
So when voting, no vote should be cast solely on the basis of any party. The values of each individual candidate must be examined using the standard of biblical righteousness cited by Frederick Douglass, the principles of Christianity as cited by Robert Brown Elliott, and an awareness that voters will answer to God for their vote, as pointed out by the Reverend Charles Finney. An illustration of this important principle is seen in the life of Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration who worked with the Reverend Richard Allen to found the AME Church. Dr. Rush served in the presidential administrations of 3 different presidents, each of whom was from a different political party. How could he do this? What was his own party affiliation? He once explained,
I have been alternately called an aristocrat and a Democrat. I am neither. I am a Christocrat. I believe all power will always fail at producing order and happiness in the hands of man. He alone who created and redeemed man is qualified to govern him.
Very simply, Benjamin Rush didn't care what a party called itself. When he found someone who stood for God's principles, he would stand with him, no matter the party. The love of correct principles, and not the love of a party, must be the key to our political involvement. What legacy of faith and politics will we leave for the next generation? Obviously, the choice is ours. But having this choice, we should heed the warning delivered to citizens in 1803 by the Reverend Matthias Burnett.
Consider well the important trust which God has put in your hands. To God and posterity, you are accountable for your rights and your rulers. Let not your children have reason to curse you for giving up those rights and prostrating those institutions which your fathers have delivered to you.
Leaders for generations have wisely recognized that the quality of our government depends more upon the quality and character of our leaders than upon any other factor. And they also understood that we were responsible for choosing leaders of character and righteousness, just as Frederick Douglass reminded voters of this truth based on Proverbs 14:34, so too did the Reverend Francis Grimke. Francis Grimke was born to a slave mother in 1850 in South Carolina and served as a valet in the Confederate Army until emancipation. After the war, he attended Lincoln University, Howard University, and Princeton Theological Seminary, then became minister of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., the same church earlier pastored by the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. Grimke was also one of the forces behind the formation of the NAACP, and in a sermon delivered on Sunday, March the 7th, 1909, Reverend Grimke admonished his hearers on their civic responsibilities based on God's righteousness.
The stars and stripes, the old flag, will float over all these states. Yes. If the time ever comes when we shall go to pieces, it will be from inward corruption. Amen. From the disregard of right principles, from losing sight of the fact that righteousness exalteth a nation, yes. But that sin is reproach to any people. Amen. The secession of the southern states in 1860 was a small matter with the secession of the Union itself from the great principles enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, yes. In the Golden Rule, yes. In the Ten Commandments, yes. Come on, in the Sermon on the Mount. That's it. Unless we hold and hold firmly to these great fundamental principles of righteousness, yes. Our union will only be a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Yes. Amen. If it continues to exist, it will be a curse and not a blessing. My Lord.
Wall Builders, you'll experience more of America's forgotten history and heroes. You'll discover again our great moral, religious, and constitutional heritage through award-winning DVDs, tapes, CDs, books, and other exciting materials. America's godly heritage clearly shows all the beliefs and ideals that once guided our nation's leaders, ideals that have too often disappeared with tragic results. In David Barton's 4 Centuries of American Education, you'll see the evidence for America's educational decline. You'll also see the leading educators and textbooks of the past that once made America a world leader in education. This video will challenge and inspire us to reach educational greatness again. The spiritual heritage of the United States Capitol, winner of both the Angel and Telly Awards, brings to life the exciting religious history of our nation's most cherished landmark. Through dramatic reenactments, you'll experience the great events and inspiring lives that shaped our nation in its early years. Through a compelling video tour, you'll marvel at the works of historical and religious art, and you'll discover the true stories of the many godly heroes honored within its halls and chambers. Featuring the only existing tour of the Capitol on video, the spiritual heritage of the United States Capitol is an unforgettable journey you don't want to miss. In the role of pastors and Christians in civil government, you'll discover how the church played an invaluable part in the struggle for America's independence. You'll learn about the leadership of Christian founders in establishing American government. By carrying out teachings found throughout the pages of the Bible, Christians changed the course of a nation. In addition, Wall Builders offers a wide variety of intriguing works in print. All are available through our website at wallbuilders.com or write to us at P.O. Box 397, Aledo, Texas 76008. For information, call 817-441-6044, and for phone orders, 1-800-873-2845. Contact us today.